The train didn't slow down the way Clara expected it to. She had ridden trains before, short runs between small towns where the engine wheezed and groaned and the whole thing shuddered to a stop like an old man sitting down too fast. But this one slowed gradually, almost reluctantly, as if even the locomotive knew that Red Creek, Wyoming was not a destination so much as a place where things ran out. The prairie outside the window flattened into dust and dry grass. A water tower appeared, then a cluster of buildings, then the platform, and the people standing on it. Clara pressed her face briefly to the glass. She couldn't help it. She told herself later that she was just looking for the station sign, but that wasn't true. She was looking for him, for the man whose letters she had memorized. She had read them so many times the folds were soft as cloth. You will find Red Creek a place of honest work and clean air. I am a man of straightforward nature and steady income. I believe we can build something together if you are willing. Straightforward nature. She had liked that. She had been around enough men who said one thing and meant something else entirely, and the plainness of his words had felt like a promise. She gathered her suitcase from the overhead rack. It wasn't heavy. She had learned long ago not to carry more than she could lift on her own. And she held it against her side as the train hissed to a stop and the doors opened. Red Creek in early October smelled like turned earth and horses, and something faintly metallic that she couldn't identify. The platform was maybe 30 feet long. A few people stood waiting, a woman in a gray dress holding a baby on her hip, two men in work clothes leaning against the wall, a boy of maybe 12 chewing something and watching the train with dull interest. And then she saw him. She knew him from the single photograph he'd sent. Taller than she'd imagined, dark hair going gray at the temples, a clean-shaved jaw. He was standing just past the end of the platform with three other men, and he was looking at her already, which meant he recognized her too. Clara stepped down onto the platform and started toward him. She could feel the weight of other people's attention, that specific awareness of being watched that she'd grown up with, being the charity case, the girl from the struggling family, the one who didn't quite fit. She had learned to walk through it, like walking through weather. You kept moving. You kept your chin level. "Mr. Gerald Marsh," she said when she reached him. He looked at her for a long moment. Not the way a man looks at someone he's glad to see. More the way a man looks at something he ordered that came out wrong. "That's me," he said. "I'm Clara Hartwell." "I can see that." The three men beside him were quiet. One of them, heavy-set, with a red beard, glanced away like he was suddenly very interested in the water tower. Clara set her suitcase down. "I imagine you have a wagon. If you want to tell me where to put my things, Miss Hartwell." Gerald Marsh put his hands in his coat pockets. "I'm going to be plain with you." She waited. "The arrangement we had in those letters, I've given it considerable thought, and I don't think it's going to work." She heard it. She understood the words. But for a moment they didn't quite land, the way sometimes you can drop a glass and stand there watching it fall and your hands don't move. "I see," she said. "It's nothing personal. You've never met me. I've met you now." He shifted his weight. "You're not what I was expecting." Around them, the platform had gone quiet in the particular way that meant everyone was listening while pretending not to. The woman with the baby had stopped bouncing it. The boy had stopped chewing. "What were you expecting?" Clara asked. Gerald Marsh looked uncomfortable, which she supposed was something. "Someone more—" He stopped, started again. "The arrangement doesn't suit me. I'm willing to pay for your return ticket. I used the last of my money to get here. Then I'll pay for a return ticket." "There's nothing to return to." He pulled out his wallet, counted out some bills without looking at her, held them out. "This should cover it." Clara looked at the money. She looked at his face. Then she looked at the bills again, and something happened in her chest. Not breaking exactly, more like a door swinging shut on a room she'd been standing in too long. She took the money. She would need it, and pride was a luxury she couldn't currently afford. "Thank you," she said, and she turned around. She didn't know where she was walking to. The street ran away from the platform in both directions. A hardware store, a feed supply, what looked like a hotel. She had $12 and the clothes on her back and a suitcase with two dresses, a photograph of her parents, and a small knife her father had given her the year before he died. She had no plan. She walked to the end of the platform and sat down on her suitcase. She was not going to cry. Not here. Not with all these people watching. She would sit here and think and figure out what came next, and she would do it with her face composed, and then she would do whatever needed doing. That was a rotten thing to watch. She looked up. The man who had spoken was sitting on a wagon just off the platform, a flatbed with lumber stacked in the bed. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, with a face that looked like it had spent a lot of time outdoors, not weathered in the ruined way, but set in, like a fence post that had been in the ground long enough to become part of the landscape. His hands on the reins were large and scarred in the particular way of someone who works with tools. "I've had worse days," Clara said. "Have you?" "Several." He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not pity. She was good at identifying pity. She'd seen it her whole life. But something more like assessment. "I've got 2 kids at home," he said. "My wife passed 14 months ago. House is a mess, kids are half wild, and I've got a contract to fill by November that's going to take every hour I've got." He paused. "I'm not offering anything except a dry place to sleep and meals and $2 a week. But if you need somewhere to be while you figure out what's next, you can come figure it out there." Clara looked at him. "I don't know you." "Elias Boone," he said. "I build things. Mostly furniture, some structures. I've got a place about 2 miles outside town." He tilted his head toward the street. "Everybody in this town knows me. You can ask whoever you want." "What would I be doing exactly?" "Cooking, mostly. Keeping the place from falling into complete disorder. Helping with the kids, though I'll warn you they're not easy right now." He said it matter-of-factly, not making excuses. "Noah's 12 and he's been angry since his mother died. Lily's 7 and she cries if you look at her wrong. It's a lot to ask of a stranger. And if I decide after a week that it isn't working, then you go and I pay you for your time." Clara looked down at the bills in her hand, then back at the man on the wagon. She had, in her life, made decisions from a position of strength and decisions from a position of having no other choice. She was not naive enough to pretend this was anything other than the latter. But she also knew that a man who leads with, "It's a lot to ask," is a different kind of man than one who pretends everything is simple. "All right," she said. "Show me." Then, the road to Elias Boone's property was exactly as unglamorous as the rest of Red Creek. Ruts and dried mud and the occasional rock that sent the wagon jolting sideways. Clara held on to the board beside her and watched the town disappear behind them and the land open up, wide and flat and brown in October, with mountains in the far distance that looked like something painted there rather than real. Elias didn't try to make conversation, which she appreciated. She was not in a mood for it. He did say, about a mile out, "The kids don't know I went to town today to look at lumber. They're going to be surprised when I come back with company." "Surprised how?" "Noah's going to be suspicious. Lily's going to hide. That's how they handle most things right now." "How long has it been since anyone new came to the house?" "My sister-in-law stayed for 3 weeks after Martha died. That was over a year ago." He paused. "It's just been us." Clara absorbed that. 3 people living in the particular silence that follows a death, trying to find their way back to some version of normal that no longer existed. She knew something about that kind of quiet. "I won't pretend to replace anyone," she said. He glanced at her. "Good. I wasn't expecting you to." The cabin appeared around a bend, and calling it a cabin was generous. It was more accurately a cabin that someone had been adding to over the years without quite finishing any of the additions. There was the original structure, solidly built, and then a room attached on one side that was clearly newer, and what looked like the beginning of a porch that had stalled somewhere around the 3rd support post. The yard around it was functional rather than tended, a garden that had given up for the year. A woodpile that was stacked high and neat, the one thing, she noticed, that had been properly maintained. There was a boy sitting on the fence near the barn. He was watching them with his arms crossed. "That's Noah," Elias said quietly. Clara looked at the boy. He had his father's jaw and an expression of someone who has decided in advance to disapprove of whatever is about to happen. Elias brought the wagon to a stop and climbed down. "Noah, come here." The boy took his time doing it. "This is Miss Clara Hartwell. She's going to be staying with us for a while and helping out around the house." Noah looked at Clara the way you'd look at something you stepped in. "Where'd she come from?" "The train," Clara said. "Why?" "I was supposed to meet someone here. It didn't work out." "So you're staying with us instead?" His tone made it clear what he thought of this logic. Your father offered. I accepted. He does that, Noah said. Not to her, to Elias. You just take in strays. That's enough, Elias said, not loudly. I'm just saying what it is. And I said that's enough. Noah's jaw tightened. He looked at Clara once more, sizing her up, and then walked back toward the barn without another word. Clara picked up her suitcase. He's going to be a problem, she said. Probably, Elias agreed. All right. She followed him to the door. 1. Lily was not in the house when they came in, but her presence was drawings pinned to the walls, a doll propped in the chair by the fire, small muddy boot prints on the floor near the door that no one had wiped up. The main room served as kitchen and sitting room both, with a table that held the evidence of a breakfast that hadn't been fully cleared, and a hearth with good bones but a badly built shelf above it that listed to the left. She's probably in the back, Elias said. He went to find Lily. Clara stood in the middle of the room and looked at it. It was not a dirty house, exactly. More a house where things had gradually slipped from their proper places and no one had the energy to put them back. The kind of disorder that happens slowly, almost without anyone noticing, when people are surviving rather than living. She recognized it. She had grown up in something similar. She set her suitcase by the wall and took off her coat and hung it on the peg by the door. She found a broom. She wasn't going to transform the place in an afternoon. That would be absurd and also intrusive. But the floor could be swept, and the breakfast dishes could be washed, and the fire could use another log. Small things. The kind of thing you do when you're in a strange place and you need something to do with your hands. She had swept half the floor when she heard a small sound behind her. She turned around slowly. Lily was standing in the doorway to the back room, holding the edges of it like she might need to retreat quickly. She was small for 7, with her father's dark hair and large dark eyes, and a quality of stillness that seemed almost unnatural in a child. She was looking at Clara the way children look at things they haven't been told whether to be afraid of yet. Hello, Clara said. Lily didn't say anything. My name is Clara. I'm going to be staying here for a while. Still nothing, but she didn't run. I'm almost done sweeping, then I was going to see about supper. Do you know if there's anything in the larder? Lily pointed to a door on the far wall. Thank you, Clara said. She went back to sweeping. After a moment, she heard the small sound of Lily's feet on the floor, not quite coming closer, but not going away either. Elias came back into the main room 10 minutes later to find the floor swept, the dishes in the basin, and a woman he'd brought home 6 hours ago standing at his larder with the door open, taking inventory with the focused expression of someone solving a problem. He stood in the doorway for a moment. There's salt pork and dried beans and half a sack of flour, Clara said without turning around. And what I think used to be carrots. When did you last buy supplies? 2 weeks ago. What did you eat last night? There was cornbread. And before that? Clara, I'm not criticizing, I'm assessing. She closed the larder. I can make something with the beans if they're soaked tonight. Do you have a Dutch oven? Under the counter. Good. He watched her pull it out and set it on the table. You don't have to do all this tonight. I'm not doing it for you, she said, and then seemed to catch herself. That came out wrong. I just mean, I need to be useful. If I'm being useful, I'm not thinking about today, and right now I'd rather not think about today. Elias was quiet for a second. Fair enough. She sorted through the beans. Lily had come further into the room and was now sitting at the table watching Clara's hands. Clara didn't make a big thing of it. Just talked to Lily the same way she talked to anyone, without the special high voice some people used with children. These need to soak overnight, she said. Tomorrow I can make a proper meal. Tonight it'll be whatever we can put together quickly. She looked at Lily. Are you hungry now, or can you wait? Lily held up one finger. A little hungry or a lot hungry? Lily considered this, held up 2 fingers. We can work with that. Supper that first night was not impressive. Salt pork fried up with the last of some onion Clara found, cornbread from the leftover batter Elias hadn't thrown out, and hot water with dried herbs that wasn't quite tea but was warm. They sat at the table, the 4 of them, with the particular tension of people who don't know each other yet. Noah ate like he was trying to finish before he had to sit there any longer. He didn't speak to Clara directly, but he also didn't say anything actively hostile. which she counted as a provisional success. Lily ate with careful, precise movements, watching everything. Elias ate the way a man eats when he's been feeding himself and 2 children for over a year, efficiently, without comment, as if food has become primarily functional. "It's good," he said when he was about halfway through. "It's barely anything," Clara said. "It's hot and it's here. That counts." She looked at him. He was looking at his plate. "Tomorrow I'll do better," she said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." He looked up. They held each other's gaze for a second, and she saw something in his eyes she recognized. That quality of being so tired for so long that you've stopped knowing what rest would feel like. She'd worn that look herself. "All right," he said. After supper, Lily helped clear the table without being asked. Or rather, she picked up her own plate and stood there with it looking uncertain, and Clara said, "You can put it in the basin." And Lily did, very carefully. Noah disappeared outside. Elias stood in the yard for a while, looking at the dark. Clara washed the dishes alone and listened to the particular silence of the prairie at night, which was not empty silence. There were crickets still, and somewhere something that might have been an owl, and the wind in the dry grass. But it was the kind of silence that made room for thinking. She thought about the train platform, about Gerald Marsh's face when he looked at her, that specific expression of disappointment she had been trying her whole life not to see on people's faces. She thought about the $12 in her coat pocket and the $2 extra a week she'd been promised, and whether that would be enough to eventually get somewhere else, or whether somewhere else was even where she wanted to go. She didn't know. What she knew was that the dishes were clean and the fire was banked, and there was a little girl somewhere in this dark house who had held up 2 fingers to say she was hungry, and that had felt for a moment like something. She dried her hands and went to the room Elias had shown her, a small space off the kitchen that smelled like old wood and cedar. And she sat on the edge of the cot and took out the photograph of her parents and held it in the dark for a while. Her mother's face, her father's hand on her mother's shoulder. "You'll figure it out," her father used to say. He said it the way some people say prayers, not because they're sure of anything, but because saying it made the next step possible. She put the photograph away and lay down on the cot with her coat over her and stared at the ceiling. She would figure it out. Set. The first 2 weeks were an education in what the house needed. Not what it needed eventually or in some ideal future, but what it needed right now to function. The shelf above the hearth needed to be refastened. She found a nail and a spare piece of wood in the shed and did it herself one morning while Elias was at work, and it held. The root cellar had potatoes in it that hadn't been touched since early summer because nobody had thought to check. She found them on the 3rd day and worked them into every meal until they were gone. The water barrel near the kitchen door had a slow leak that had been solved by someone putting a bucket under it, which meant that every day someone had to empty the bucket, which meant the floor near the door was perpetually damp. She found the crack, packed it with tallow, and let it cure for a day, and after that the bucket sat dry. These were not dramatic things. Nobody applauded. Elias noticed them the way you notice that your shoulders stopped hurting. Not all at once, but incrementally, and then with a kind of low-grade surprise when you realized how long it had been since the thing had been wrong. Noah noticed too. He just didn't say so. He was, she had decided, not a bad kid. He was a kid who had lost his mother at 11 and had spent the year since trying to hold a shape he didn't quite know how to hold. He took care of the livestock without being asked. He chopped wood. He kept his own space tidy, which told her something. The anger wasn't random. It was aimed, mostly at the general situation, and she happened to be the newest part of that situation. She didn't push him, didn't make attempts at warmth that he hadn't invited. She let him be surly and uncommunicative and didn't take it personally, or tried not to. When he did a thing well, fixed the bridle on the smaller horse, got the fire going quickly on a wet morning, she said so without ceremony. Not good job in the exaggerated way, just that was good thinking. He pretended not to hear her. But he stopped leaving the room quite so fast when she came in. Lily was different. Lily had decided fairly quickly, within the first week, that Clara was safe. Not trustworthy exactly, not yet, but safe. She started following Clara around in the mornings without quite following her, occupying the same room, drifting close, and then back. One afternoon, Clara was mending one of Elias's shirts at the kitchen table, and Lily climbed up into the chair across from her and put a doll on the table and began, very seriously, mending an invisible tear in the doll's dress with an invisible needle. Clara watched her out of the corner of her eye for a moment, then went back to her work. They sat like that for an hour without speaking, and it was, somehow, companionable. The work was real and it was hard, and Clara was not going to pretend otherwise. Cooking 3 meals a day for 4 people with limited supplies, keeping the fire, managing the water, taking inventory of what was needed in town. These things took time and energy, and she came to bed tired in a way she hadn't been in years. But there was something in the tiredness that was different from the tired she had felt before. Before, being tired meant you had spent yourself on things that weren't yours. This tired felt like something she had made. She still didn't know if she was going to stay. That was the truth she kept returning to in the quiet hours. She had come here in desperation, and desperation was not a foundation. She needed to stay long enough to get some money together, to think clearly, to figure out what the next step looked like. She was not planning her life around a barn and a broken porch and a man who spoke in short sentences and 2 kids who were doing their level best to get through the days. She told herself this regularly. It was around the 3rd week that Elias came home from a job site with a split on his left hand. Not deep, but bad enough that it needed cleaning and wrapping, and he had managed to get sawdust in it, which was going to be a problem if left alone. He came in trying to hold a rag against it and not drip on anything, and Clara was at the hearth, and she saw it immediately. "Sit down," she said. "It's fine." "It's not fine. There's sawdust in it. Sit down." He sat. She got the bison and the cleanest cloth she had, and the small tin of salve she'd bought on her first trip to the general store in town. She worked in silence, cleaning the wound with more efficiency than gentleness. There was no good way to get sawdust out that was also painless, and Elias sat without making noise, which she appreciated. "You should have come home earlier," she said. "There was a board that needed finishing." "The board would have waited a day." "I have a deadline." She looked up at him. He was watching her hands. "The deadline won't matter much if that gets infected and you lose the hand," she said. "That's extreme." "I've seen it happen." She had, in fact, a neighbor of her parents years ago. She tied off the bandage. "Keep this dry for 2 days." "I can't keep it dry. I work with wood." "I know you work with wood. Keep it dry for 2 days and then do what you want." He looked at the bandage, then at her. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Pay attention to your hands. They're how you work." She turned back to the fire before she could see his expression, because there was something in the way he was looking at her that she didn't quite know what to do with yet. By the end of the first month, she had started making a list. Not of things she needed, though she had that list too. This was a different kind of list, a private one, kept in her head rather than on paper. The things that had shifted, the things that felt different from the first day. Lily had started calling her by name. Not Mama, not Miss, just Clara, the way you call someone you've decided to trust. Noah had asked her once, just once, how she got the shelf to stop leaning, and she had told him plainly, the anchor point was wrong, and the wood needed to be into the stud, not just the plaster. He had nodded and gone outside. But 3 days later, she found him refastening the loose hinge on the barn door, using the same principle. Elias had started coming home at a consistent hour. She didn't know if that meant anything. He was a man who kept his head down and did his work, and didn't ask for more than he needed. He wasn't unkind. He was actually, she had come to realize, quite careful. He paid attention to things without drawing attention to paying attention. When she had come home from her second trip to town looking wrung out, he had asked, without preamble, "Was Marsh in town?" And when she said no, he had just nodded and said nothing else. But she understood that he had been watching for that possibility. She hadn't asked him to do that. There was an evening in late October, nearly 5 weeks in, when the wind came hard from the northwest and the temperature dropped 30 degrees in the space of an afternoon. Elias got the extra blankets from the chest in the back, and Noah brought in extra wood without being asked, and Lily found the old quilt that had belonged to her mother and brought it out and spread it on the settle without looking at anyone. They ate supper with the wind pulling at the walls, and Clara had made soup, real soup, not just hot water, because she had found dried mushrooms in the back of the larder she hadn't known were there, and she had added them to the beans and the salt pork, and it was actually genuinely good, better than anything she'd made yet. She set the pot in the middle of the table, and they all ate from it. And Lily had 2 bowls, and Noah, without looking up, said, "This is good." Clara said, "Thank you." He went back to eating. But there it was, small and grudging and real. She lay awake that night and listened to the wind and thought about her father saying, "You'll figure it out," and thought that maybe what she was figuring out was not what she had expected to figure out. She was not ready to say what that meant, but she thought it, in the dark, in the small room that smelled like cedar, with the quilt from a dead woman spread over her because Lily had wordlessly put it there. She thought it, and she let herself think it, and then the wind eased a little, and she slept. November came in ugly. Not the gradual kind of ugly that gives you time to prepare, but the fast kind. A blue norther that blew in overnight and left the world white and mean by morning. Clara stood at the kitchen window with a cup of something hot in her hands and watched the snow come sideways across the yard and thought that the unfinished porch was going to be a serious problem if the cold kept up. The 3rd support post was still not set. Wind was already working at the overhang, making it flex in a way that suggested it wasn't long for the world. She mentioned it to Elias at breakfast. He looked out the window at it. "I know. It's going to come down. I know that too. Can you fix it before that happens?" He poured himself coffee and didn't answer immediately, which was not a no but wasn't a yes either. She had learned his silences enough by now to know the difference. This one meant he was running numbers in his head. Time against work, against daylight, against the contract he was already behind on. "I'll look at it this weekend," he said finally. "The weekend is 4 days away. Clara, I'm just saying what's true." "I heard you." He drank his coffee. "I'll look at it this weekend." She let it go. She had also learned in the 6 weeks she'd been here that there were certain kinds of problems Elias needed to solve in his own time, and that pushing him on them only made him dig in. He wasn't stubborn in a stupid way, more in the way of a man who has been solely responsible for everything for so long that being told what to do felt like an accusation. Noah came in from the barn trailing snow and cold air and the smell of horses. He shed his coat on the peg and sat down at the table without saying anything. "The gray mare's left front shoe is loose," he said. Not to anyone specifically, to the room. "I'll check it after breakfast," Elias said. "I already packed it, just thought you should know." Clara set a plate in front of him, biscuits from last night's leftover dough, fried up because the oven was being temperamental, with salt pork alongside. He ate. After a moment he said, "These are better fried than baked." "The oven runs hot on the left side," Clara said. "Burns the bottoms." "It's always done that." "I know. I've been working around it." "You could just not use the left side." "That's what I've been doing. But if someone packed the flue properly, it would run even." Noah chewed. "I can pack a flue." "I wasn't asking." "I know." He pushed his plate slightly toward the center of the table, the Noah equivalent of a shrug. "I'm just saying I can." Clara looked at him. He was looking at his plate. She didn't make it into anything, just said, "All right, when the weather breaks." That afternoon, while Elias was in the barn and Lily was asleep on the settle with a quilt over her, Clara stood in front of the oven problem with her sleeves rolled up and her hair escaping from its pins and tried to figure out whether the issue was the flue or the grate or something else entirely. She burned one hand on the damper before she thought to use a cloth. She said something under her breath that was not polite. She fixed the grate with a piece of bent metal she found in the shed, and the oven ran better after that. Not perfect, never perfect, but better. She didn't tell anyone she'd done it. The woman who changed things, and not for the better, was named Ruth Calloway. Clara met her on a Wednesday in town, her second trip to the general store since arriving in Red Creek. She had a short list: salt, thread, lamp oil. Elias had given her money for it without her asking, which she noted. She was trying to make the money last, walking down the aisles with a careful eye, when the woman came in behind her. Ruth Calloway was maybe 50, with the posture of someone who had always been comfortable taking up space. She had a good coat and a sharp face, and the specific kind of friendliness that is really just a more efficient version of hostility. "You must be the woman staying out at Boone's place," she said. Clara turned. "I am. I heard about what happened at the station." Ruth's tone managed to convey sympathy and judgment simultaneously, a technique that must have taken years to perfect. "Gerald Marsh is not a kind man. I said so when he first started writing letters back east. It's past, Clara said. Of course it is, still. She tilted her head. How long are you planning to stay on with Elias? I haven't decided. He's a good man. Quiet, but good. Those children need a steady hand. She paused in the way of someone who has more to say and is pretending to consider whether to say it. I do think people wonder, though, about the arrangement. Clara set a box of salt in her basket. Wonder how? Well, you're an unmarried woman living in a widower's home. People talk. It's not your fault. These things happen in difficult circumstances, but I do think you should be aware. I appreciate the warning, Clara said, which was the most neutral response she could find. I'm sure you're perfectly respectable, Ruth added, which made it worse. I just wouldn't want the children to suffer for it. People can be unkind. Clara paid for her things and walked out. She stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment in the cold, her basket on her arm, and breathed carefully. She was not going to let Ruth Calloway ruin the afternoon. She was not. She walked to the wagon and put her things in the back and drove home, and by the time she pulled into the yard, she had decided not to mention it to Elias. It was nothing she hadn't already known, in some vague way. People were going to say whatever they were going to say, and nothing she did was going to change that, and the only thing that mattered was whether the people in that house trusted her. Lily was at the window when she came in, waiting, which was new. I found something at the store, Clara said, and she pulled from the bottom of the basket a small packet of hard candies, red ones, that she had paid for from her own $2. She had seen them and thought of Lily without quite deciding to buy them until she was already paying. Lily stared at them, then at Clara. They're yours, Clara said. You can have one now and save the rest. Lily took the packet very carefully with both hands and held it against her chest. Thank you, she said, very quietly. First time she had put two words together in Clara's direction. You're welcome, Clara said, and went to put away the salt. It was Noah, surprisingly, who told her about Martha. Not all at once. It came out sideways, the way things come out with 12-year-old boys, in the middle of something else. They were splitting kindling one afternoon in late November, Noah on the axe and Clara stacking because she'd twisted her ankle slightly on the icy step that morning and couldn't stand on it comfortably for long stretches. He was good with the axe, more careful than you'd expect, and efficient. She used to do that, he said at one point. Clara looked up. Do what? Stack it that way, with the big pieces on the outside. She looked at the wood pile. She hadn't thought about it. That was just how her mother had stacked wood. Is there a different way you want it? No. He set another piece and split it. It's fine. She waited. He split 3 more pieces before he spoke again. She got sick in March last year. He said it to the wood, not to her. She thought it was just a cold, then it wasn't. Clara kept stacking. Dad tried to get the doctor from Millhaven, but it was mud season and the road washed out, and by the time he stopped, picked up another piece. It went fast after that, 3 weeks. That's fast, Clara said. Yeah. He split the piece harder than necessary. Lily doesn't remember her right. She thinks she does, but she gets things wrong. She remembers her hair, and she remembers she smelled like lavender, but she gets her voice wrong when she talks about her. The voice is wrong. Clara stopped stacking. She looked at him. He was not looking back. How does she get it wrong? Clara asked. She makes it soft, like a lullaby voice. Noah said another piece. Mom's voice was like, it was normal, like a regular person. She didn't talk to us soft like we were babies. He paused. I'm the only one who remembers it right. That was the weight he was carrying, not just the loss, but the specific terror of being the last repository of an accurate memory, and knowing that even his would fade. You should tell Lily, Clara said, when she gets it wrong. Not to correct her, just to tell her, so she knows. She cries. I know, but she'd probably rather cry and have it right than not know. She picked up the next piece of wood. That's what I'd want, if it was me. Noah didn't say anything, but he didn't disagree either, and for him, right now, that was roughly the same thing. December brought a hard freeze that split one of the rain barrels clean in half and took out the last of the garden Clara had been hoping to salvage. It also brought a letter for Elias, which she handed to him at supper without reading it, because of course she hadn't read it, but which he read twice at the table and then set face down beside his plate. The contract got extended, he said. That's good, isn't it? It's more work and the deadline moved up. He rubbed the side of his jaw. I'm going to need to work Saturdays through the end of the month. That's fine. I know it's more time alone here with the kids. I said it's fine, Elias. He looked at her. There was something in his face she was getting better at reading, that particular expression when he was about to say something he'd been working up to saying. I want to pay you more, he said. What I offered at the start was an emergency arrangement. You've been doing more than what we agreed on. I know you don't need it. I'm offering it. I'm not going to argue about being paid fairly, she said, but I also don't want to talk about it like it's a transaction every week. I know you're not. Let's say $4 a week and not discuss it further. He thought about that. I was going to say 5. 4 is fair. Clara, you fixed the oven and the rain barrel bracket and you provided shelter when I had none. We're not behind. She started clearing plates. $4. He watched her for a moment. You are unusually stubborn about money. I was raised not to take more than I'm worth. I'm not sure you're right about what you're worth. She turned around because there was something in his voice that made her need to see his face. He was looking at her directly, and he wasn't being charming about it. Elias Boone was not, she had come to know, a charming man. He was just saying something plain and true, the way he said most things. She turned back to the dishes. $4, she said. Fine, he said. $4. Christmas that year at the Boone place was modest in the way things are modest when money is careful and grief is still present enough to make celebration feel complicated. Clara did not try to make it into more than it was. She made a good meal, a chicken from the yard that had stopped laying and was therefore available, cornbread, dried apples, something like a pie that she hadn't quite perfected but that smelled right coming out of the oven. She found a bit of ribbon in the bottom of her suitcase and tied it on the table for color. Elias came in with 2 small packages. He set them on the table without ceremony, one for each child. Noah got a folding knife with a proper blade, the kind a working boy needs. He opened it and looked at it for a long moment, and then looked at Elias and said, "Thanks, Dad," with a directness that seemed to cost him something. Elias nodded and looked away. Lily got a small carved horse. Clara could tell from the finish that Elias had made it himself, in the shed, at some point in the past weeks without anyone knowing. Lily held it in both hands and turned it over slowly, and then climbed up into Elias's lap without preamble, which was the most direct she had ever been with her father in Clara's presence, and Elias put his arm around her and didn't say anything. Clara stood at the oven and busied herself with something that didn't need attention. After supper, when the children were asleep, Elias stayed at the table with his coffee, and Clara washed up, and the kitchen was quiet except for the fire. She stopped eating for 2 weeks, Elias said. After Martha died, just wouldn't eat. I didn't know what to do. Clara kept her hands in the wash water. Lily? Yeah. He was looking at the table. The doctor in Millhaven said it sometimes happens with young children, that it passes. It did pass. But those 2 weeks were... He stopped. You were scared, Clara said. I didn't know what I was doing. I still don't most of the time. You're doing it, though. That's not the same. It's more than you think. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind was low and the stars were out. She could see them through the kitchen window, scattered and cold and very bright. Noah's doing better, Elias said, since you've been here? Noah's doing better because he's ready to do better. I just didn't get in the way. You gave him something to push against. He needed that. He needed someone who wasn't you. Grief gets complicated when it's the same person you're mourning and grieving with. He couldn't fall apart in front of you, and you couldn't fall apart in front of him, and you were both walking around held together with wire. Elias looked at her. Did you study that somewhere? No, I've been in situations where everybody needed to hold it together and nobody was allowed to crack, and eventually the whole structure goes wrong. She dried her hands. I'm not held together with wire. That helped. He thought about that. I don't know much about where you came from. Before. No? He waited to see if she'd say more. My parents died when I was 19, she said. Both of them. Same winter. 2 months apart. Flu. After that, I worked in a dry goods store for 2 years, and then a hotel kitchen for 3 years, and then I answered Gerald Marsh's advertisement. She paused. That's the whole story. No, it isn't. Not all of it, no. She folded the cloth over the basin. But that's what I'm ready to tell right now. He nodded. He didn't push, which she had known he wouldn't. What about you? She asked. Came west from Ohio. I was 22. Built my first house for a man named Pruitt, who didn't pay me fully but gave me the land I've got now. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Met Martha at a dance in Mill Haven. She laughed at something I said, and I thought, that's that. Married her 8 months later. She sounds like she was good. She was real, he said, and she understood the distinction. She didn't put on a face for people. No. Clara looked at the table, at the ribbon she'd tied there for Christmas. That's rarer than it should be. The fire settled with a small sound, and outside the night was very still, and Clara thought about the woman whose quilt was on the cot in the cedar room and whose horse was now in Lily's hands, and she thought that grief leaves furniture and objects and routines behind, and sometimes they outlast the grief itself and become just things, objects in a life. The quilt was warm, the horse was beautiful. Those things could exist without erasing the loss. She didn't say any of that. I should check on the fire before bed, she said. I'll do it, Elias said. She said goodnight and went to the cedar room and lay down in the dark, and she listened to the sound of him banking the fire, and she thought that this was a strange life she had stumbled into, and that strange wasn't the same as wrong. January was when she got sick. Not dramatically. She didn't collapse or develop a fever that had everyone frantic. She just woke up one morning with a throat like sandpaper and a heaviness behind her eyes that she tried to push through and couldn't. By noon, she was running a real fever, and she knew it because the kitchen felt like it was tilted slightly sideways, and the smell of the soup she was making turned her stomach when it should not have. She sat down at the kitchen table. She was not good at being sick. She found it humiliating in the way that people who have always had to manage for themselves find any incapacity humiliating. She sat at the table with her hands flat on the surface and tried to decide whether she could finish the soup or whether she needed to lie down. Lily found her. Clara? I'm fine, Clara said. I just need a minute. Lily went away. Clara put her head down on her arms, which she had not planned to do, and closed her eyes for what felt like a moment and was apparently longer. She woke up to Elias crouched beside the chair, one hand on her forehead. How long have you been sitting like this? He said. I don't know. Her voice came out wrong. You have a fever. I know I have a fever. Can you stand? Yes. She stood, which proved more difficult than expected, and he caught her arm without making a thing of it. I'm fine. The soup needs... I'll handle the soup. You don't know how it's... Clara. He said it firmly, not unkindly. Go lie down. She went. The next 2 days were unpleasant, in the specific way that illness is unpleasant when you're not used to being taken care of, and everyone is trying to anyway. Elias brought her broth, made from something that was technically soup, not as good as hers, good enough, and told her not to talk. Lily sat in the doorway of the cedar room at intervals and watched her with serious dark eyes. Noah appeared once with a cup of water and set it on the floor near the cot without looking at her and left, which Clara understood was the most he was capable of and was therefore sufficient. On the third day her fever broke and she felt, as she always felt after a fever broke, suddenly hollow and very tired and oddly clean. She came out to the kitchen wrapped in the quilt and found Noah at the stove, squinting at a pot. What are you doing? She said. He startled, which she pretended not to see. Making something. What? I don't know yet. He stirred it. Dad showed me how to do the salt pork and beans yesterday. I'm trying the same thing. She sat down at the table. The beans need more time. I know. And you'll want to add the salt at the end, or they won't soften. Dad said the same thing. He didn't look at her. You should eat something. I know. There's biscuits from yesterday. They're not good. I'm sure they're fine. They're not. He found one on the shelf and put it on the table in front of her. But it's what there is. It was, in fact, dense enough to be a mild hazard. She ate it anyway because she was hungry, and because Noah had put it in front of her, and those two things combined made it acceptable. "Thank you," she said. "For the biscuit?" "For the biscuit." He stirred his pot. "Dad stayed home yesterday," he said. "He told the job site he'd be late." She looked up. "He doesn't do that," Noah said, not accusing, just noting. "He hasn't missed a day in a long time." Clara looked down at the biscuit. "He stayed because you were sick," Noah said. "I thought you should know that." "Noah, I'm not saying anything." He lifted the spoon and looked at whatever was on it. "I'm just telling you." He set the spoon back down. "The beans are going to need another hour." She sat at the table and listened to the fire and the wind and the sound of the beans simmering, and she thought about Elias staying home, and she thought about the way he'd caught her arm without making a thing of it, and she thought about Noah bringing water and Lily sitting in the doorway, and she was going to cry, which was irritating, but she was also weak from the fever, and that was her excuse. She didn't cry. She sat very still until the feeling settled, and then she ate the terrible biscuit in its entirety. And when Noah wasn't looking, she put her face briefly in her hands and breathed. She had come here with nowhere to go. At some point, without planning it, and without quite knowing when it had happened, she had stopped thinking about what came next and started just being here. In this kitchen, with these people. That was not, she knew, the same as deciding to stay. But it was getting harder to imagine leaving. The morning in February, when everything shifted, started like most mornings. Cold, gray, the water in the basin having a thin skin of ice that she broke with her knuckle before washing her face. She came into the kitchen and Elias was already at the table, which was unusual. He was normally out to the barn before she was up. He had a piece of paper in front of him, and he was looking at it the way he looked at things that were a problem. "What is it?" she said. He looked up, considered, then pushed the paper across the table. It was a letter. The handwriting was unfamiliar, not the looping script of the official correspondence she'd seen him receive before, but something smaller and more deliberate. She picked it up and read it, and as she did, the kitchen got very quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. The letter was from Gerald Marsh. It was brief. It said, in the language of a man who had taken some time constructing his meaning, that he had heard Clara was still in Red Creek, that he had given the matter considerable thought, and that he believed his original arrangement was still, technically, in effect. He wanted to meet and discuss it. Clara set the letter down. "When did this come?" she asked. "Yesterday. I needed to think about how to tell you." "You could have just told me." "I know." He folded his hands on the table. "Are you going to go?" She looked at him. "No." "He might push it." "He can push whatever he wants. We had letters, not a legal document, and he ended it publicly in front of the whole town." She folded the letter and set it aside. "He has no claim." "You're sure?" "I'm sure." Elias looked at her steadily. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. She made coffee. He went to the barn. The morning continued the way mornings continue, through the small, necessary work of keeping a place going, and Clara moved through it with her shoulders set and her jaw level, and she told herself that whatever Gerald Marsh wanted, he was not going to get it, and she was right. She just didn't yet know how hard he was going to try. She didn't respond to Gerald Marsh's letter. That was a decision she made deliberately, on the second morning after Elias had shown it to her, when she had slept on it and woken up clear. She had turned it over from every angle she could think of, and every angle arrived at the same place. A response, any response, was an acknowledgement that he had something to respond to. He didn't. She folded the letter and put it in the bottom of her suitcase under the photograph of her parents, and she went about her day. Elias didn't bring it up again, which she appreciated more than she could have easily explained. February ground on the way. February does in Wyoming. Not softening, not relenting, just enduring. The cold had a quality of permanence to it, the kind that makes you stop believing in spring. The days were short, and the work was not, and Clara found herself settling into the rhythm of the place in a way she hadn't quite anticipated. She stopped counting weeks. She stopped mostly thinking about the money she'd saved and what it might get her somewhere else. That reckoning was still there, somewhere in the back of her thinking, but it had moved to the back, and other things had moved forward. Noah had started talking to her, not conversations exactly, more an ongoing exchange of practical information that occasionally wandered into something adjacent to ordinary speech. He told her that the gray mare's shoe had been repaired properly by the farrier in town, and she was sound again. He told her, unprompted, that the woodpile was getting low on the split oak, and he was going to work on it Saturday. He told her once, while they were both at the barn, that his mother had kept a garden in the summer and grown tomatoes that were better than anything you could buy, and that he didn't know what she'd done differently. Probably bone meal, Clara said, and she might have pinched the suckers early. What's a sucker? She explained. He listened with the focused attention he gave to practical things. I could try that, he said, in spring. If you're still... He stopped. If I'm still here, she said. Yeah. He picked up a feed bucket. I wasn't assuming. I know you weren't. I just meant you could tell me before spring so I know whether to bother. I'll tell you, Clara said. He nodded and went to the horses, and Clara stood in the barn doorway for a moment with her arms crossed against the cold, looking at the sky, which was the particular flat white of a Wyoming February afternoon. She had not said she'd be here. She had only said she'd tell him. But she thought about tomatoes, and she thought about bone meal, and she thought that was close enough. A scene. The second letter from Gerald Marsh arrived on a Thursday in late February, and this one was different. It was longer. The language was still careful, but underneath the careful language was something harder, the tone of a man who had expected a response and not received one, and had decided to interpret the silence as a challenge rather than an answer. He referenced this time the correspondence they had exchanged prior to her travel. He used the word arrangement 4 times. He said he had consulted with a man in Millhaven who understood these matters, and that he believed the original terms were still in effect, pending formal dissolution. Clara read it at the kitchen table while Elias watched her face. He's inventing a legal position, she said when she finished. We had letters. Letters aren't a contract. He seems to think differently. He can think whatever he wants. She set the letter down. Who is this man in Millhaven? He says he consulted. Probably means Hector Gaines. He's not a lawyer, he's more of a... He handles business disputes, draws up documents. Elias paused. He has some influence in the county. Enough to make something stick that isn't real? Enough to make it complicated. He was being careful with her, she could tell. Not withholding, but measured. Clara, Marsh has money. Not a lot, but enough. And he has standing in this town in a way you don't yet. If he decides to make this into something... He rejected me publicly, she said, on a train platform, in front of 30 people. I know. Half this town saw it. I know that too. He folded his hands on the table the way he did when he was working through something. What I'm saying is that the people who saw it aren't the ones who would decide anything official. Marsh knows that. He's betting that the inconvenience of fighting him is worse than whatever he's offering. Clara looked at the letter. He hasn't offered anything. He will. She sat back. The fire was going well, and the kitchen was warm, and Lily was drawing on a scrap of paper at the other end of the table, her tongue pressed between her teeth in concentration. Clara watched her for a moment. I'm not going to respond, she said. Clara, not yet. I want to see what he actually does before I give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Elias was quiet. Then, all right, but I want you to tell me if it changes. If you get another letter, or if he approaches you in town, or if... I'll tell you. I mean it. Elias, she met his eyes. I'll tell you. He held her gaze for a moment and then nodded once, and that was settled. She saw Gerald Marsh in town 10 days later. She had not planned it, and she was fairly certain he had. She was coming out of the general store with flour and a spool of brown thread when she nearly walked into him on the wooden sidewalk, and the half second before she registered who it was, she saw something in his expression that told her the collision was not accidental. Miss Hartwell, he said. Mr. Marsh. He looked different than she remembered from the platform. Not better or worse, just assembled more carefully. His coat was brushed. He had the look of a man who had spent some time deciding how to have this conversation. I've written to you twice, he said. I received the letters. I didn't hear back. No, she agreed. Something moved in his face. Not quite anger. more like the low-grade frustration of someone who had expected a specific reaction and was recalibrating. I'd like to sit down and discuss the situation like reasonable people. There isn't a situation to discuss. I think there is. You ended the arrangement publicly, Mr. Marsh, in front of witnesses. Whatever you've decided since then isn't my concern. The arrangement wasn't legally anything, she said, which means it doesn't require legal dissolution either. We exchanged letters and we met once. That's the full extent of it. He stepped slightly closer, not threateningly, but in the manner of someone used to size working in his favor. He was taller than her by a significant margin. I'm trying to be civil. You're being civil, I noticed. I'd like the opportunity to make this right. Make what right? You made a decision. I made a different one. That's the end of it. You're living in Boone's house, he said, and his voice shifted slightly. Still civil, but with an edge now. The whole town knows it. That's a difficult position for a single woman. Clara felt the cold of the February air and the cold of what he was implying, and held herself very still. Is it? I'm not trying to embarrass you. I'm trying to offer you a more secure arrangement. I'm secure. You're a housekeeper. I'm a woman who can keep herself, she said. That's different. He looked at her for a moment, assessing, and she could see the moment he decided she wasn't going to fold easily. His jaw set slightly. I've been in contact with Hector Gaines. He believes there's a case to be made that the correspondence we exchanged constitutes a binding agreement, and that my decision on the platform was made under duress. She nearly laughed. She did not. Under duress. I was persuaded by other parties that, Mr. Marsh, she shifted her basket to her other hand. You looked at me and decided I wasn't what you wanted, and you said so. There were no other parties. There was no duress. There was just you, making a free choice. She paused. I'm making one now, too. Good day. She walked past him. Her hands were not entirely steady when she got to the wagon, and she sat for a moment before picking up the reins and making herself breathe normally. Not because she was scared. She was not exactly scared. More because the conversation had made real something she'd been keeping in the abstract. Gerald Marsh was not going to let this go quietly, and whatever Hector Gaines could or couldn't do, the fact that he was invoking the man's name meant he was preparing for a fight. She drove home and told Elias that evening. He listened without interrupting, which was something she'd learned to appreciate about him. When she finished, he sat across from her at the kitchen table and was quiet for a moment. Gaines, he said. That's what he said. Gaines has done this before. Not exactly this, but adjacent things. He finds the edge of what's legal and he works it until the other person gives up. He looked at his hands. He got a man named Pelter to sign over grazing rights 3 years ago because the paperwork was technically ambiguous and Gaines kept filing motions until Pelter couldn't afford to fight anymore. I don't have anything to sign over. No, but he might try to make your situation here complicated enough that it becomes easier to leave. She looked at him. Is that what you think I should do? No. He said it without hesitation, and she noticed that. I'm telling you what he might try. Not what I want. What do you want? The question came out more directly than she'd meant it to, and she felt it land in the kitchen between them, slightly too big for the moment. Elias looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, something that moved through his face and then got held back. I want this not to turn into something that costs you, he said, whatever else you decide. It was a careful answer. She decided to accept it as what it was. I'm not leaving over Gerald Marsh, she said. I want to be plain about that. Good. I'm going to need to understand my options, though. Is there anyone in Red Creek or Millhaven who is actually a lawyer? There's a man named Aldous Webb in Millhaven. He's legitimate, trained in Chicago. Elias paused. He's not cheap. How much? He told her. She did the arithmetic in her head against what she'd saved in the months she'd been here. It was uncomfortable math, but it was possible. Can you get a message to him? She asked. I can ride to Millhaven Saturday. I'll write it tonight. He nodded. Clara. He waited until she looked at him. You don't have to do this alone. She heard that. She let it sit for a second longer than was probably comfortable. I know, she said, but I need to know I can. He didn't argue with that. She had not expected him to. March came without ceremony, and the snow began finally to ease. Not gone, it would not be truly gone for another 6 weeks, but the quality of it changed, from the hard-packed, permanent-feeling drifts of deep winter to the wetter, heavier snow that meant the season was tilting. The response from Aldous Webb in Millhaven arrived in the second week of March, and it said, in clear and carefully worded language, that the correspondence between Clara and Gerald Marsh did not constitute a legally binding contract under territorial law, that the public termination of the arrangement was well documented by witnesses and could be established without difficulty, and that any claim Hector Gaines constructed on Marsh's behalf would be both legally weak and expensive for Marsh to pursue. It also said in its final paragraph that if Marsh chose to pursue the matter anyway, Webb would represent Clara at a reduced rate given the nature of the situation. She read that last paragraph twice. Then she folded the letter carefully and put it in her coat pocket and walked out to the barn where Elias was repairing a hinge on the stall door. "Webb says the case is weak," she said. Elias looked up from the hinge. "How weak?" "Weak enough that he thinks Marsh won't press it if he meets any real resistance." She leaned against the stall door. "He says the public rejection in front of witnesses is essentially the whole argument." "That's what I thought." He went back to the hinge. "Marsh isn't brave. He's used to people folding. He might still try to make noise." "He might. I want to be ready for it." "I know." He set the hinge pin and tested the movement of the door. "What does being ready look like to you?" She thought about it. "Having Webb's letter. Knowing the witnesses I could call." She paused. "And not being afraid of the noise itself." Elias stood and looked at her. In the low light of the barn, with the smell of hay and horses around them, he had the particular quality he sometimes had, of being exactly where he was, fully present, not somewhere else in his head. She had noticed this about him early on. He did not drift. "Are you afraid?" he asked. "Some," she said, which was the truth. "Not of Marsh, exactly. More of—" She stopped. "I've spent a lot of my life in situations where other people had the power to determine what happened to me. I don't want to be in that situation again." "You're not. I know that. I'm telling you what I'm afraid of anyway." He was quiet for a moment. "I think that's reasonable," he said, "being afraid of a thing that happened before, even when it's not happening now. You sound like you know something about it." "Some." He picked up his tools. "When Martha died, for a long time I was afraid to make decisions, because I'd made the decision to wait for the road to clear, and she died." He said it plainly, the way he said everything, but she could hear the weight in it. "It wasn't rational. The road was genuinely impassable. But I kept going over it." "How did you stop?" "I didn't stop exactly. I just kept making decisions anyway. Made myself. And gradually the fear got smaller." He paused. "Or maybe I just got better at carrying it." "That's not comforting." "No," he agreed, "but it's true." She thought about that for a moment, standing in the barn with the light coming through the gaps in the boards. "Elias," she said. "Yeah. Thank you for going to Millhaven, for all of it." He looked at her with that steady, direct look that she had learned was his version of warmth. Not demonstrative, but present and real. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I'm not doing it for—" He stopped, started again. "I'm doing it because it's right, and because it matters to me how this goes for you." She heard something in that she was not quite ready to pick up and examine. She let it sit. "I should get back," she said. "Yeah," he said, and she went. The confrontation, when it finally came, did not happen the way she had expected. She had imagined Marsh appearing at the property or sending Gaines to speak on his behalf, or perhaps filing some document that Webb would then need to counter. She had not imagined him doing what he actually did, which was walk into the Red Creek General Store on a Saturday in late March, when she happened to be there with both children. She had brought Noah and Lily to town because the weather was finally tolerable, and she needed extra hands for the supply run, and because Lily had been asking for weeks about going to see the horses at the livery, and Clara had promised. They had done the supplies first, Lily holding the basket very carefully, Noah loading sacks of flour, and were at the counter when the bell above the door sounded. She knew without turning around. Something in the room changed, the way the temperature in a space changes when a door opens. "Miss Hartwell?" She turned. Gerald Marsh was standing just inside the door, and he was not alone. There was a second man with him, shorter, with the careful, prosperous look of someone who made a living from other people's discomfort. Hector Gaines, she assumed. Lily moved slightly closer to Clara without making it obvious. Noah's jaw went tight. "Mr. Marsh," Clara said, "I'd like a word." "I'm busy." "It won't take long." He looked at the children. His expression toward them was not hostile, but it was not warm either. More like he was registering inconvenient furniture. "There are some papers we'd like you to look at. Mr. Gaines has drafted a proposal for dissolving the original arrangement on terms that are fair to both. I've spoken with a lawyer," Clara said, "Aldous Webb in Mill Haven. He confirmed that there is no arrangement to dissolve." Marsh's expression shifted. "Webb is one man's opinion. He's an attorney licensed under territorial law. That's not opinion, that's standing." The man beside Marsh, Gaines, spoke for the first time. His voice was pleasant in the way of something that had learned to sound pleasant. "Miss Hartwell, we're not here to cause trouble. We simply want to ensure that all parties have clarity on the nature of the original. The original nature was that Mr. Marsh rejected me publicly," she said. She said it calmly and at a volume the entire store could hear, because the entire store was, at this point, listening. She could feel it. "He said, in front of witnesses, that I was not what he expected and that the arrangement didn't suit him. That was his choice, and I respected it. I'm asking him to respect mine." "Your choice," Marsh said, and there was an edge in it now. "Your choice is to live in a man's house without benefit of—" "I'm employed," she said, "as a housekeeper and household manager. That's documented. That's paid. That is not your business. The town can think what it wants." She picked up the basket. "I know what I am, Mr. Marsh. I'd suggest you think carefully about whether you want the story of this, of everything, from the platform to these letters to this conversation right here, told in any kind of official proceeding, because I'm willing to tell it." The store was very quiet. Gaines said something low to Marsh, something Clara couldn't hear. Marsh's face was doing something complicated, moving through several calculations. "Noah," Clara said, "can you get that last sack?" Noah picked up the flower without a word. He was, she noted, holding himself with a kind of conscious stillness that reminded her of his father. Lily had not moved from Clara's side. Clara walked toward the door. As she passed Marsh, she stopped. Not for long, just for a moment. "I hope you find what you're looking for," she said. She meant it, mostly. "But it isn't me." She walked out. On the sidewalk in the cold March air, she kept her pace steady until she reached the wagon. Then she stopped and put her hand flat on the side of it and breathed. Noah set the flower in the back. Then he stood beside her, not doing anything, just standing there. Lily came around to her other side and put her small hand in Clara's without saying anything. They stood like that for a moment, the three of them. "He's not going to stop," Noah said. Not a question. "He might," Clara said. "He might not." She picked up the reins. "Either way, we're fine." "You sure?" She looked at him. He was 12 years old, and he was asking her a real question with his whole face, and she gave him the truest answer she had. "I'm sure enough," she said. "That's usually how it works." He climbed up into the wagon. Lily scrambled up after him. Clara clucked to the horse, and they moved out of town, down the road toward home, and behind them Red Creek settled back into its ordinary Saturday business, except that everyone who had been in that store had seen something they would be talking about for a while. She told Elias that evening. All of it, straightforward, not softening anything. He listened at the kitchen table with his hands around his coffee cup, not interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes." "Noah?" He was steady. He didn't say anything he shouldn't. He held himself well." Elias nodded slowly. Something moved across his face that she recognized as pride, the quiet kind that parents carry without announcing. "And Lily?" "She held my hand," Clara said. Elias looked at her, then down at his coffee. "He's going to try again," he said. "Or Gaines is going to advise him to, because Gaines gets paid for the trying." He turned the cup in his hands. "I've been thinking about it." "About what?" He looked up. about whether there's a way to remove his basis for the claim entirely. She waited, because she could hear that he was working toward something. If the concern is your status in this house, what it looks like, what he can use against it. He stopped, set the cup down, started again with the carefulness of someone who has rehearsed a thing and still isn't sure of it. If you were married, it would be different. His whole argument depends on it depends on your situation being ambiguous. The kitchen was very quiet. Elias, she said carefully, I know how it sounds. How does it sound to you? He looked at her directly. It sounds like a practical solution to a real problem. And I also know that's not all of what I mean. She looked at him for a long moment. The fire was low and the light was warm, and she could hear faintly Noah moving in the room above them. Tell me what else you mean, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Not the evasive quiet, but the kind where someone is finding the right words and won't say the wrong ones to fill the silence. You make this place work, he said. You make it. He stopped. You're real. You don't pretend things are easier than they are, and you're not performing something. And the kids, he pressed his hands flat on the table. I'm not asking you out of convenience. I want to be clear about that. But you're also not ready to say it's not convenient. No. He held her gaze. It is both things. And I think you deserve someone who's honest about that. She did look away then, briefly. At the table, at the ribbon she'd put there at Christmas that had gotten worn and soft from weeks of use. I'm not going to give you an answer tonight, she said. I'm not asking for one tonight. I need to think about whether I'm making a decision because it's right or because it's easier than fighting. That's a fair thing to think about. And she stopped. I need to know that it would be real. That if I said yes, it wouldn't be a transaction that we both pretend is something else. He was quiet for a moment. It would be real, he said. I can't promise you everything that word means yet, but it would be real. She nodded. She picked up her cup and stood up from the table. Good night, Elias, she said. Good night, Clara. She went to the cedar room and sat on the edge of the cot in the dark, and she held her father's photograph in both hands without looking at it, and she thought about the choice that was being placed in front of her, not by Gerald Marsh, not by circumstance, but by a man who had just told her, in his careful and unfloored way, that the choice was hers to make. That was the thing she kept coming back to. The choice was hers. Outside, a late March wind moved through the yard. Spring was in it, cold still, but with something underneath that was different. The smell of turned earth coming through. The first suggestion of a season that hadn't been possible to believe in 3 weeks ago. She sat in the dark and she thought. She did not give him an answer the next day, or the day after that. Elias did not ask, which was its own kind of answer about who he was. He went to work. He came home. He ate supper at the table with the children and occasionally said something that needed saying and otherwise let the days be what they were. If he was waiting, he didn't show it in a way that put the waiting on her, and she noticed that and filed it away in the part of her mind where she kept things that mattered. She thought about it the way she thought about problems that didn't have clean solutions. Not constantly, but returning to it the way your tongue returns to a sore tooth, testing it from different angles, looking for what was actually true underneath what she wanted to be true and what she was afraid might be true. The thing she kept arriving at was this. She had spent most of her adult life making decisions based on what was necessary. Take the hotel job because the dry goods store closed. Answer the advertisement because the hotel kitchen was going to let her go at winter's end. Accept Elias's offer because there was nowhere else to go. She was good at necessary. She understood necessary. What she was less sure of was whether she could trust herself to know the difference between a decision that was necessary and one that was right. She talked to no one about it. There was no one to talk to, except unexpectedly, there was. It was a Thursday when Ruth Calloway appeared at the property. Clara heard the wagon from the kitchen, looked out the window, and felt the particular weariness of seeing someone you'd rather not deal with. She went to the door anyway. Ruth climbed down with a covered dish and the expression of a woman who had an agenda and had dressed for it. I heard what happened in the store, she said before Clara could speak. Last Saturday. With Marsh and that Gaines man. Word travels, Clara said. In Red Creek it travels by noon. Ruth held out the dish. Venison stew. I made too much. Clara took it because refusing would have been petty. Come in, then. Ruth came in and looked around the kitchen with the comprehensive sweep of a woman accustomed to assessing domestic situations. Whatever she saw, she kept her reaction mostly to herself. She sat at the table when Clara gestured to it and folded her hands. You handled it well, Ruth said. What you said in the store. I said what was true. That's not always how people handle things. Some women would have flinched. She paused. Marsh isn't going to let it sit. You know that. I know that. Gaines has done this before. He found a woman in Harwick County 2 years ago. Similar situation, though the details were different. Kept filing things until she gave up and left. Ruth looked at her directly. I told you before that people talk about your arrangement here. I said it badly and I've regretted it. What I should have said was, the talking is the thing he's going to use. Clara sat down across from her. What kind of talking? The kind that questions your character, your suitability. Whether Elias's home is a proper environment for children with you in it, unmarried. Ruth's mouth pressed flat. Gaines doesn't need a real case. He needs enough whisper to make Elias uncomfortable, and then he leans on Marsh's offer as the easier solution. He doesn't know Elias very well. No. Ruth considered. But he doesn't need to. He just needs to know the county clerk, which he does, and the man who assesses property disputes, which he also does. Clara looked at the covered dish on the table. The stew smelled good, and she was irritated that it smelled good. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Because I was unkind to you when you arrived. Not in a dramatic way. I was simply the kind of unhelpful that's almost worse because it looks like concern. She met Clara's eyes. And because Elias Boone is a decent man who has had a very hard few years, and those children are good children, and what you've done here is not nothing. She said it plainly, without softness. I've watched it. The town has watched it. People change their minds about things when they pay attention. Once the spechers are said. Clara looked at her for a long moment. You're telling me I have more support than I think. I'm telling you that you're not as alone in this as Marsh wants you to feel. She stood. The dish can come back whenever. Don't rush. She left without ceremony, the way she'd arrived. Clara sat at the table for a while after the wagon sounds faded, with the stew in front of her and the pale spring light coming through the window, and she thought that people were more complicated than it was convenient to believe. The answer, when it came to her, came the way most real answers come, not as a conclusion she reasoned her way to, but as something she found herself already knowing when she stopped working so hard at it. She was in the yard on a Saturday morning in the first week of April, digging the kitchen garden. The ground was still cold and the work was resistant, and her back was complaining about it in terms she couldn't ignore. She had drawn out where the beds would go, had been planning this since January, in her head, thinking about what would grow in this soil in this light, and she was working the first row with a mattock when she stopped and straightened and looked at the line she'd made in the dirt. It was her line. She'd put it there. She looked at the cabin, at the porch with its 3 support posts, all properly set now, the overhang no longer flexing in the wind, at the woodpile, stacked right, at the barn with its repaired hinge and its sound gray mare inside, at the garden row she'd just cut into ground that had been fallow and tired and was going to grow something this summer. She thought about Elias's hands on the table when he'd said it would be real. She thought about Lily's hand in hers on the sidewalk in town. She thought about Noah saying, I'm just telling you about his father staying home. She set down the mattock. Elias was in the shed. She knew because she could hear him, the particular rhythm of a hand plane working along a board, slow and even. She went to the shed door and stood in it. He looked up. She said, yes. He set the plane down. You're sure, he said. Not a question exactly, more the kind of thing you say when something you'd stopped quite letting yourself expect suddenly becomes real, and you need a second to catch up. I'm not doing it because of Marsh, she said. I want to be clear about that. I know. And I'm not going to pretend it's something it isn't yet. It's real, and I don't know all of what it is yet, but it's real. That's enough, he said. That's more than enough. He stood there in the shed doorway in his work clothes with sawdust on his sleeves, and she stood in the yard with dirt on her hands from the garden. And it was not a romantic moment by any standard she'd been offered as a model. But it was true. and she had decided some time ago that true was worth more than the other thing. "There are practical things to sort out," she said. "There are. Webb should know, and whatever filing needs to happen in the county, I'll take care of it." "We'll take care of it," she said. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face, careful and private and real. "We'll take care of it," he agreed. She told the children that evening at supper. She had thought about how to do it and decided that thinking about it too much was going to make it worse, so she simply said it after the dishes were on the table and before anyone had started eating, that she and their father had decided to get married and that she wanted them to know directly from her rather than from circumstances. Lily looked at her plate, then at Elias, then at Clara. Her face went through several things. "You're going to stay," she said. "Very small." "Yes," Clara said. Lily nodded, then went back to looking at her plate, and Clara could see from the set of her small shoulders that she was working very hard at not crying, the way children do when they've been holding something for a long time and suddenly don't have to anymore. Noah was harder to read. He sat with his fork in his hand and didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Does this mean I have to call you something different?" "You can call me whatever you want," Clara said. "I'll keep calling you Clara." "That's fine." "Okay." He picked up his fork, then set it down again. "Marsh is still going to be a problem." "Probably." "What happens then?" "Then we deal with it." He looked at her. "Together?" "Together." He nodded once, picked up his fork again, started eating. But she noticed that his shoulders, which had been carrying a particular tension for as long as she'd known him, sat slightly differently after that. Not loose. Noah was not a loose-shouldered kind of person, but less braced. The meal was not festive. It was a regular supper with salt pork and the last of the winter's stored turnips and cornbread. But Lily ate 2 full portions and hummed something quiet to herself while she did it. And at the end of the meal, Noah stood up and cleared not just his own plate but Lily's as well without being asked, which he had never done before in Clara's presence. Elias caught her eye across the table. She looked away before it could become a moment. The message from Hector Gaines arrived 4 days later. It was not addressed to Clara. It was addressed to Elias, which was itself a statement. 2 pages, formal language, the kind of document that had been written to impress rather than to inform. It claimed, with considerable elaboration, that the prior arrangement between Gerald Marsh and Clara Hartwell had created a binding obligation, that Clara's residence in Elias's home constituted a violation of the spirit of that arrangement, and that Marsh was prepared to seek remedy through the county court unless the matter was resolved to his satisfaction. It also, in its final section, made an offer. Marsh would withdraw all claims and all filings if Clara agreed to formally dissolve the arrangement in his presence, with a signed document, and departed Red Creek within 30 days. Elias read it twice. Then he handed it to Clara without speaking. She read it, set it on the table. He escalated. "He heard about us," Elias said. "Someone in town told him." "Of course they did." She looked at the document. "He's not going to get what he wants." "No, but he can make it expensive and complicated for a while." Elias sat down. "I want to write to Webb today." "Already planning to," Clara said. "But there's something else I want to do first." He looked at her. "I want to go see Marsh myself," she said. "Clara, not to negotiate. I'm done negotiating. I want him to hear from me directly that this is finished and that anything he files we will answer in court, and that the answer will include a full account of everything from the platform in October to every letter to that conversation in the store." She kept her voice level. "I want to look at him and say it, so he understands it's not a bluff." Elias was quiet for a moment. "I'll come with you." "I'd rather go alone." "I know you would." He looked at her steadily. "I'm coming anyway. Not to speak. You do the speaking. But I'm not sending you to that conversation without—" He stopped. "I'm not sending you alone." She looked at him. There was something in his expression that was different from all the careful, measured things she'd seen there before, something less contained. She thought about what it must have taken for him to say it, for a man who expressed care mostly in actions rather than words. "All right," she said. "We go together." Gerald Marsh's property was a mile east of town, a house better than the surrounding land warranted, which told you something about where his priorities lived. He was in his yard when they arrived, working at something near the fence, and he straightened when he saw the wagon. His face went through several things when he saw them together. Clara climbed down without waiting for help and walked toward him. She had dressed for this the same way she'd dressed for difficult things her whole life, cleanly and practically, nothing that could be read as either aggression or supplication. "Mr. Marsh," she said. He looked past her at Elias, who had stayed beside the wagon with his arms at his sides and his face neutral. "Boone," Marsh said. Elias said nothing. Clara brought Marsh's attention back. "I received the document from Mr. Gaines," she said. "I want to tell you personally that we're not going to comply with any part of it." Marsh's jaw set. "That's your attorney's job. My attorney will file the response. I'm here to make sure you hear clearly from me that this is finished." She kept her hands loose at her sides. "You had the choice to honor what we'd arranged. You made a different choice, publicly, in front of the whole town. I made my choices since then. You don't get to rearrange that because you've changed your mind. The document from Gaines is a document. Our attorney will respond to it. I'm not here to discuss the document." She paused. "I'm here to tell you that if you file anything in county court, we will answer it in full. Every letter, every conversation, every witness from that platform." She kept her voice even. "I don't want to do that. It won't help either of us. But I will do it without hesitation if you make it necessary." Marsh looked past her at Elias again. There was something in his expression that was, she recognized, about Elias more than about her. Something that had to do with the specific injury of a man who discarded something and then watched someone else value it. "You planned this," he said. "To Elias, not to her." Elias said calmly, "I didn't plan anything. I offered a woman shelter when you left her stranded. Everything else followed from that. It's convenient for you." "It worked out well for me," Elias said. "That's not the same as convenient." Marsh turned back to Clara. Something in him was recalculating. She could see it. The document, the threats, the Gaines machinery, it had been built on the assumption that she would eventually fold, that the pressure would become more than the resistance. He was looking at her now and understanding that his assumption had been wrong. "What do you want?" he said. "What is it that you actually want from me?" "I want you to withdraw the document and end this," she said. "That's all. No conditions. I'm not asking for an apology or an acknowledgement or anything else. Just end it and let it be ended. And if I don't, then we see it through. And it will cost you more than it costs us because we have nothing to lose and you have a reputation you apparently care about." The yard was quiet. A horse in the distant corral shifted and stamped. Marsh looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the ground. "I'll talk to Gaines," he said. "That's your business," Clara said. "I've said what I came to say." She turned and walked back to the wagon. Elias didn't move until she reached it, and then he climbed up beside her and she picked up the reins, and they drove out of the yard without looking back. They were a quarter-mile down the road before either of them spoke. "You did that well," Elias said. "I was scared the entire time." "I know, you didn't show it. I was showing it on the inside." He was quiet for a moment. "He'll drop it. He won't want the public record." "Probably. You gave him a way out that didn't humiliate him. I gave him the only option that ends it cleanly. What he does with it is his problem." She kept her eyes on the road. The April land was opening up around them, pale green coming in at the edges of things, the smell of mud and new grass. "I'm tired of him taking up space in my head." "Then let's not give him any more." She exhaled. Slowly. The tension in her shoulders, which she hadn't fully noticed until it began to release, was considerable. "Elias," she said. "Yeah, what you said back there, about it working out well for you." She glanced at him. "Was that for his benefit, or did you mean it?" He looked at her straight. "I meant it." She turned back to the road. "Good," she said. Webb's formal response to Gaines's document went out the following week, and it was Clara learned when she finally read a copy, a thorough and cleanly argued thing that dismantled the claim at every point it tried to make. Webb had a precise, unflashy style that she appreciated. No performance in it, just the argument, built carefully. Gaines replied 10 days later with something shorter and less certain. Webb replied to that in 3 paragraphs. Marsh dropped the matter entirely in the first week of May. There was no announcement and no formal withdrawal. just silence, and then a note from Webb saying that Gaines had informed him the matter was closed. Clara read the note at the kitchen table and set it down and said nothing for a moment. Elias was watching her from across the table. "That's it?" she said. "That's usually how it ends," he said. "Not with anything dramatic. They just stop. I was expecting something more." "I know." He almost smiled. It was the kind of almost smile she'd learned to read like punctuation. Real things end quietly. She looked at the note again, then she folded it and set it with the others. She would keep it. You kept these things. "When do you want to talk to the minister?" she asked. "Whenever you're ready." "I'm ready." "Then Saturday." "Saturday," she agreed. It was a plain exchange, like most of the important things between them. No flourish. She had stopped expecting flourish from Elias and had started, without quite deciding to, finding the plainness its own kind of thing. She wrote to Aldous Webb the following day to thank him and settle the remaining balance of his fee, which she paid from her own money, and she wrote it as a personal note rather than a formal letter, which felt right. She also wrote a letter she had not planned to write. She sat at the kitchen table in the evening after the children were in bed, and she wrote to the woman who had run the hotel kitchen where she'd worked for 3 years, whose name was Agnes Pruitt, and who had been harder on Clara than she'd deserved, and also, in the end, kinder than she'd had any obligation to be. Agnes had been the one who told her about the mail-order arrangement services, had said, without sentiment, "You're not going to find what you need within 2 days' train ride from here." Clara had been angry about that for a while, and had then understood that Agnes was right, and had gone looking. She didn't explain everything in the letter. She said she had found her way to a place in Wyoming, that she was going to be married in May to a carpenter and widower with 2 children, that she was going to plant a kitchen garden in the spring, and that the soil looked like it might actually respond. She said, "I think you'd find the children difficult. I think you'd like them." She sealed it. She didn't know if Agnes Pruitt would write back. She sent it anyway. The wedding was on a Saturday in the second week of May, at the courthouse in Mill Haven, which was practical and cost less than a proper ceremony and suited them both. Ruth Calloway came, which surprised Clara, and brought her husband, a quiet man named Douglas, who shook Elias's hand twice and seemed to regard the whole proceeding with approval. Aldous Webb was there because he happened to be in town and Elias had mentioned it, and he stood at the back and nodded to Clara when she came in. Noah wore his good shirt and kept his hair down and stood beside his father during the proceeding with his hands in his pockets. He didn't look uncomfortable. He looked serious, which was different. Lily had asked the evening before if she could put a ribbon in Clara's hair on the day. "If you want to," Clara had said. Lily had produced from somewhere in her room a length of blue ribbon that must have been Martha's. Clara had looked at it in Lily's small hands and hadn't said anything for a moment. "Are you sure?" she'd said finally. "Yes," Lily said, very certain. The way Lily was certain about a few specific things, and nothing on earth was going to move her. So Clara had worn it, blue ribbon and practical dress, and her father's photograph in her coat pocket because she carried it everywhere. And she had stood in the Mill Haven courthouse on a May morning and said what needed saying in front of a judge and a handful of people. And Elias had said what needed saying, and the judge had said what needed saying, and that was that. They shook hands with people afterward, and Ruth Calloway kissed Clara on the cheek, which was unexpected, and Douglas Calloway shook Elias's hand again, and Aldous Webb said, "Congratulations," in the genuine way of someone who means it, rather than the formal way of someone who is expected to say it. Lily held Clara's hand on the way back to the wagon. Noah walked ahead with Elias, and at some point Clara noticed that Noah said something, and Elias put his hand briefly on the back of Noah's neck. The kind of touch that doesn't have language, that is just presence. And Noah didn't shrug it off. She filed that away too. On the drive home, with Mill Haven behind them, and the May afternoon warm enough that Lily had pushed her coat off her shoulders, Clara looked at the land opening on both sides of the road, pale green going to deeper green now, the first real growth of the season coming in, and thought about October, which felt like a different life and was also, plainly, the same one. She thought about standing on the Red Creek platform with $12 and a suitcase, watching a man she'd traveled hundreds of miles to meet, look at her with his wallet out and his face arranged in disappointment. She thought about sitting on the suitcase afterward, about Elias's wagon at the edge of the platform, about him saying it's a lot to ask of a stranger before he asked it. She had thought that day that she was at the bottom of something, that the train platform was the lowest point and everything else was figuring out how to climb. What she understood now, driving home through the May afternoon with her husband on one side and two children in the back, was that she had been looking at it wrong. It wasn't the bottom of something. It was the beginning of something she hadn't had language for yet. She wasn't sure she had the right language for it now, either. She was not good at certain kinds of naming. But she knew what the kitchen looked like in the morning when the light came through the east window. She knew what it sounded like when Lily hummed to herself over her drawings. She knew the sound of Noah's footsteps coming in from the barn, and the difference between the footsteps that meant the morning had been fine and the ones that meant something had gone wrong with the livestock. She knew what it felt like when Elias came home. Those things were not language. They were something else. Lily had fallen asleep against her arm. Clara adjusted slightly so the child's weight was more comfortable, and she did not move away. Elias glanced over. He saw. He said nothing, just turned back to the road, but there was something in the set of his face that she recognized now, that private quality of a man who has something and knows it, and is quietly, carefully glad. The road went on ahead of them through the spring. She held the reins and let it. The garden came up in June, not all at once. Nothing in a garden happens all at once, which is either the point or the frustration depending on what kind of person you are. The beans went in first, pushing through the soil in their deliberate way, and then the carrots, and then the tomatoes that Clara had started from seed in small pots on the kitchen windowsill 6 weeks before, nursing them through the last cold nights with a piece of burlap she'd cut from an old feed sack. By the middle of June, the beds were full enough that you could see what they were going to become. Noah had helped with the planting. Not enthusiastically. Enthusiasm was not his mode, but with the focused, competent attention he brought to anything he decided was worth doing. He had remembered about pinching the tomato suckers. She hadn't reminded him. He'd just done it one morning while she was working the neighboring bed, and she'd looked over and seen him doing it correctly, and she'd said nothing, and he'd said nothing, and that had been its own kind of conversation. He was 13 in June. The birthday passed without drama. She made a proper cake with the last of the sugar, and Elias gave him a book on surveying that had been expensive and had required a special order from Millhaven, and Noah spent the better part of an afternoon reading it at the kitchen table with the focused intensity he usually reserved for physical problems. At supper he said, without preamble, "I want to learn to survey land." "I know," Elias said. "There's good money in it, and the territory's going to need people who can do it right as things get settled." "I know that too." "So you think it's a reasonable plan?" "I think you're 13, Elias said, "and I think it's a reasonable plan." Noah considered this. "That's not a contradiction?" "No," Elias said. "It isn't." Clara cut the cake and said nothing, but she was watching Noah's face, that particular quality of a boy who is beginning to see himself as something other than the person the bad years made him, who is cautiously, tentatively, trying on a future. It was not a comfortable thing to see, because the trying on was fragile and she knew it, but it was also the best possible thing she could have seen at that table on that evening in June. Lily announced, with the calm authority she'd been developing since approximately March, that she wanted a piece with a flower on it. "There's only one flower and it's in the center," Noah said. "I know, I want the centerpiece." "I was going to have the centerpiece." "You can have the corner," Lily said. "Corners are bigger." Noah looked at her. Lily looked back. She was 7 years old, and she had spent enough of her life being quiet and accommodating that she had apparently decided she was done with it, and Noah, who understood the economics of that better than most people, gave her the centerpiece without further argument. Clara watched this and thought, there it is. There's what a family sounds like. But it didn't sound the way she would have written it if she'd been asked to write it. It sounded like arguing about cake and land surveying, and not like anything she'd been told families were supposed to sound like. But it was real, which was the only standard she'd decided to hold it to. The summer settled into a pattern that was not comfortable exactly. Comfort implied ease, and nothing about running a household and a working property was easy. But that had a quality of rightness to it, of things fitting into their correct shapes. Clara learned the land the way you learn anything you're going to have to work with for a long time. Not all at once, but incrementally. The particular drainage of the south field, and the way the wind came through the gap in the western hills, and which of the kitchen garden beds needed more water and which needed less. She and Elias had the kind of marriage that probably looked spare from the outside. They didn't talk around things. They didn't perform things for each other. She had discovered, in the months since May, that he had a dry, quiet sense of humor that emerged in situations where she least expected it, and that he was a better listener than she had initially understood, not because he asked many questions, but because he heard the things underneath the words she said, which was harder and rarer. They disagreed regularly about money. He was inclined toward investment, toward the ranch he'd always wanted to expand, more land, more livestock. She was inclined toward security, toward keeping a reserve that could absorb a bad season or a sick animal without threatening everything they'd built. These were not philosophical differences so much as different fears shaped by different histories, and they had to be negotiated each time rather than resolved once. Sometimes she won the argument, sometimes he did. Occasionally they found something in the middle that neither of them had thought of at the start. She had been wrong, she understood now, to have expected that love, or whatever this was, this thing they were building, would eliminate friction. The friction was part of it. You didn't build something solid out of materials that never pushed back. What she hadn't expected was that she would be grateful for that. She had thought, most of her life, that what she wanted was ease. She understood now that what she actually wanted was something more durable than ease. Ease went away. The other thing stayed. Agnes Pruitt wrote back in July. The letter came in the usual mail, mixed in with a supply invoice and a notice about a county road assessment, and Clara didn't recognize the handwriting at first. She opened it at the kitchen table in the afternoon while Lily was napping and the house was quiet, and she read it twice. Agnes was characteristically brief. She said she was glad to hear Clara had landed somewhere solid. She said the children sound like work, which means they're probably worth it. She said the hotel kitchen had gone through 2 people since Clara left, and neither of them had been able to get the bread right, which she said without apparent awareness that it was a compliment. At the end she wrote, "You were better than the work I gave you. I knew it. I thought the harder I pushed, the longer you'd stay. That was selfish of me, and I'm sorry for it. I'm glad you went." Clara sat with that for a while. She was glad she'd gone too. She was glad in the specific way you're glad about things that hurt. Not in spite of the hurt, but including it, because the hurt was part of the path, and the path had led here and here, with all its difficulty and its cold winters and its complicated children, and its spare and honest man was where she was supposed to be. She wrote back to Agnes that same evening. She told her about the garden, and about Noah's surveying book, and about the overhang on the porch that Elias had finally properly finished in the spring, and that she walked under every day and felt, each time, a small specific satisfaction in. She told her that Lily had recently decided she wanted to learn to read properly, not just the words she already knew, and that they had been working at it in the evenings after supper, and that Lily learned fast when she decided she wanted something. She didn't try to explain the larger shape of it. Some things didn't reduce to letters. It was August when Gerald Marsh left Red Creek. She heard it from Ruth Calloway, who appeared at the property one afternoon with news the way she had appeared with venison stew, unexpectedly, and with the air of someone who had felt it their responsibility to come. "He sold the property," Ruth said. "Took an offer from a man in Cheyenne and signed the papers last week. He'll be gone by the end of the month." Clara was weeding the garden when Ruth told her this. She sat back on her heels and looked at the row of beans. "All right," she said. Ruth looked at her. "That's all you have to say." "What else would I say?" "Most women in your position would have something more to say about it." "I don't have a position about it," Clara said. "He made choices. So did I. He's going. That's fine." She pulled a weed and dropped it in the basket. "I hope he does better somewhere else. I mean that." Ruth considered her for a moment with the assessing expression Clara had come to recognize as her version of respect. "You're a strange woman, Clara Boone. I've been told." "I mean it kindly." "I know." She looked up. "How's Douglas?" They talked about Douglas's knee, which had been giving him trouble, and about the church roof, which needed work, and about the general store's new supply of cotton fabric that Ruth thought was overpriced. It was the ordinary talk of neighbors, and Clara sat in the garden and participated in it. And when Ruth left, she went back to the weeding and thought about Gerald Marsh for the last time. She thought, I don't hold it against him. Not because she was incapable of holding things against people. She was human, and she was capable of that. She had her list like anyone. But because Gerald Marsh had rejected her on a platform in October, and she had, as a direct result, ended up exactly here. You could not hold against someone the action that led you to the right place. That was a philosophical position she had arrived at through living rather than through thinking, and she thought it was one of the more useful things she'd figured out. The bean plants needed tying where they'd gotten ahead of the stakes. She got more twine from the shed and tied them back carefully, and the garden was fine. Noah's moment, the one she hadn't been expecting, came in September. He had been going to the one-room school in Red Creek since spring, at Elias's insistence and his own reluctant participation. He was behind the other students his age in some things and significantly ahead in others, which was frustrating to him in the way that being uneven is frustrating to someone who prefers to be competent across the board. The teacher, a man named Garrett, who had trained back east and come west for reasons he kept to himself, had recognized early that Noah was not a problem student but a bored one, and had given him harder work, which had helped. In September, Garrett sent a note home. Clara was the one who opened it, because Elias was at a job site and the mail came midday. She read it at the table and then read it again. It said, in the precise language of a man accustomed to writing careful things, that Noah had demonstrated exceptional ability in mathematics and spatial reasoning, that he had essentially taught himself the core principles of geometric survey from the book Elias had given him, and that Garrett believed he should be considered for the county scholarship examination in the spring, which could provide for 2 years of schooling in Cheyenne with proper instruction in engineering and land survey. It also said, and this was the sentence Clara read 3 times, I have taught in 3 territories, and I have met perhaps 4 students in 15 years with this quality of mind. I do not use that comparison lightly. She folded the letter. She put it in her apron pocket. She went to find Noah, who was at the barn. Come inside, she said. He looked at her expression and came without arguing, which told her he knew something was up. She gave him the letter at the kitchen table. He read it. His face did not change expression in any dramatic way. He was not a dramatic expression kind of person, but something happened behind his eyes that she watched carefully. He put the letter down. Cheyenne is far. It's a day's ride. That's far. Noah. He was quiet. What do you think? She said. I think Garrett is saying I'm good at math. He's saying more than that, and you know it. He looked at the letter again. The scholarship examination is in March. I'd have to study for it. We know that. Dad would have to know I was going to be away for 2 years. He would. He might need me here. He might, Clara said. Or he might be fine. We're not behind on anything. The property is solid. If there's a bad season, we handle it the way we always handle it. She kept her voice even. This isn't about whether we can manage without you. This is about whether you want to try. He sat with that. What if I fail the examination? He said. Then you don't get the scholarship and you figure out what's next from there. That's not reassuring. It's not meant to be reassuring. It's meant to be true. She looked at him. I've been in situations where I didn't try things because I was scared of what happened if I failed. You know what I have to show for those situations? Nothing, not even the experience of having tried. She paused. The experience of having tried is worth something even when it doesn't work. Noah looked at the letter, then out the window at the September afternoon, which was clear and gold and already carrying the first edge of autumn in it. I want to try, he said, like it cost him something to say it. Then we'll tell your father tonight. He's going to... He stopped. He's going to say yes, isn't he? What do you think? He thought about it. Yeah, he said, he is. He picked up the letter and folded it with more care than he usually handled paper and put it in his shirt pocket, and Clara watched him do it and thought about October. About a 12-year-old boy sitting on a fence with his arms crossed and his face arranged in preemptive hostility toward a woman he'd never met, and thought about the distance between that boy and this one, and thought that the distance was not something she had created. It had been there, waiting in him, all along. She had only not gotten in the way. That mattered. But it wasn't the same as making it. Elias said yes. He said it the way he said most things that were important to him, briefly, directly, and with no performance around it. He read the letter at supper. He looked at Noah. He said, "March is 6 months away. You'd better start working." Noah nodded. "And you'll write," Elias said. "If you go, letters, real ones, not just a line saying you're alive." "I know how to write a letter." "Then you'll write them." "Okay." Elias folded the letter and slid it back to Noah's side of the table. "Good," he said, and that was the conversation. Later, after the children were in bed, Clara came in from checking the fire and found Elias sitting at the table with his coffee, not doing anything, just sitting. She sat across from him. "Are you all right?" she said. "Yeah." He turned the cup in his hands. "He's not going to be in this house in a year and a half." "Probably not. I know that's how it's supposed to go. Kids leave." He paused. "I know that. It's still strange when it's actually happening. Very strange." He looked at his coffee. Martha she'd have cried and then made him a cake and then cried again. Clara smiled. "That sounds right. She was better at the emotional parts than I am. You're not bad at them." "I'm very bad at them. You're bad at performing them. That's different." She looked at him. "You're here. You're paying attention. You remembered the surveying book. You said yes without making him feel guilty about it." She paused. "Those are the emotional parts. The rest is just theater." He looked at her. That private expression. "When did you get so certain about things?" "I'm not certain. I'm just deciding to act like I am until I'm more right than wrong." He almost laughed. "Not quite." "Close enough." "Clara," he said. I'm glad you didn't get on that return train." She looked at him across the kitchen table, in the house she had walked into with her coat on her arm and a broom in her hand because she'd needed something to do with her hands. In the kitchen she had cooked 10,000 meals in the chair across from the man who had offered her shelter when she had none and had been honest with her about every difficult thing since. "So am I," she said. Well, Lily learned to read properly that autumn. It had taken most of the summer, patient, halting evenings at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, Lily's finger moving under the words, sometimes getting it and sometimes not, and sometimes getting frustrated in the particular way she expressed frustration, which was by going very still and pressing her lips together and not speaking. Clara had learned not to rush those moments. She would wait, and eventually Lily would try again. In October, on an ordinary Wednesday evening, Lily read an entire page of a simple book without stopping and without help. She looked up at Clara when she finished. Clara said, "You did it." Lily looked back down at the page, then up again. Her face was doing something complicated. Pride and disbelief and something else, something that wasn't quite either of those things. "I want to read the next one," she said. "Go ahead." She read the next page, and the one after that. She read until the lamp started to burn low, and Clara said she needed to sleep, and even then Lily asked if she could take the book to bed. "You can," Clara said. Lily took the book and went. Clara sat at the table in the low light for a moment before getting up to bank the fire. There was a shape to what had happened in this house in the past year that she had not planned and could not have planned. She had come here broken and broke, with no claim on anything, and she had simply done what needed doing, not from nobility, not from some clear-eyed plan, but because doing what needed doing was the only way she knew how to be in a situation. And the situation had gradually, imperceptibly, become a life. She thought about what she would have said to herself on that train platform in October, if she could have said anything. She didn't think she would have said, "It gets better," because that was the kind of thing that sounded right and meant nothing. She thought she might have said, "The next place you put your feet is solid ground, even if you can't see it yet. Take the step anyway." She didn't know if that was wisdom. It might just be the story she'd made afterward to fit the shape of what happened. People did that. They looked back at the random and frightening decisions and told themselves there had been a logic to it all along. Maybe there had been. Maybe there hadn't. She had stopped needing to know the difference. The first snow of the new season came in early November, and it came gently. Not the hard norther of the previous year, but something softer, the kind that settled instead of driving. Clara stood at the kitchen window in the morning and watched it come down in the gray light and thought that it looked like the same snow from a completely different direction. Elias came in from the barn with snow on his coat and his breath showing. He stomped his boots at the door and hung his coat and looked at the window. "Early this year," he said. "Yes?" "You're looking at it like it means something." "I'm just looking at it." He came and stood beside her at the window. They looked out at the yard, at the snow settling on the woodpile and the fence posts and the porch overhang that was properly built now and held its weight without complaint. "Noah's been studying," he said, "every evening. He asked me last week if I thought he was going to pass the examination." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't know, and that wasn't the point." He paused. "I don't know if that was the right answer." "It was honest," Clara said. "That's not always comfortable, but it's usually better than the alternative." He didn't seem satisfied. He wasn't looking for satisfaction. He was looking for someone to tell him he was going to be fine. You told him something truer, which is that it doesn't matter if he's fine. It matters that he tries. She looked at the snow. He'll understand that eventually. Might take a while. You're not worried about him? I'm always worried about him. That's different from thinking he's not going to be okay. Elias was quiet for a moment. And Lily is going to be formidable, Clara said. She already is. We're just the only ones who know it yet. He almost smiled. She had come to love that almost. It was more honest than a full smile for most people. Lily appeared in the doorway from the back room in her nightgown, her hair still tangled from sleep, the reading book under her arm. It snowed, she said. It did, Clara said. Can we have porridge? We can. Lily climbed up onto her chair at the table and opened the book. She read while Clara made the porridge, sounding out the harder words under her breath, the quiet work of someone practicing a new skill until it becomes natural. Elias sat with his coffee. The fire was going well. Outside, the snow came down in its patient way on the garden beds and the yard and the road that ran toward Red Creek and beyond, toward Millhaven and Cheyenne and everything farther than that. Noah came in from feeding the animals with snow on his hat, and his hands red from the cold. He pulled off his gloves and looked at the porridge and sat down. Garrison said there's 3 feet in the passes, he said. Where'd you see Garrison? Elias said. He came by the fence while I was doing the water. He was checking his south pasture. Noah poured himself water from the pitcher. He said his wife had the baby finally. Girl. I'll bring something over, Claire said. He said they're calling her after his mother. That's good. The table filled with breakfast things. Lily closed her book and ate with the focused attention she gave to food she liked. Noah ate fast the way he always ate, like efficiency was a virtue at the table. Elias ate steadily. Clara sat with them and ate her porridge and listened to the ordinary sounds of a morning, which were nothing and everything at the same time. She thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, sitting on a suitcase on a train platform. She thought about what that woman had wanted. Somewhere to be, something to do, the basic decency of not being disposable. She had not thought past that. She had not let herself. But here was what she had not known to want, because she hadn't known it was possible. To sit at a table in November snow and be so thoroughly a part of something that your absence would change its shape. To have Noah ask you a question because he trusts the answer. To have Lily save you the centerpiece of the cake without saying why. To feel, when you hear boots on the steps in the evening, not anxiety about what the night will require, but something quieter and more durable than that. To belong to people who have chosen you back. That was the thing. That was the whole of it. She had spent most of her life being left. By death, by circumstance, by men who looked at her and decided she wasn't what they wanted. She had gotten very good at the leaving. She had become efficient at it, adapted to it, had made a kind of armor out of it. I don't need to be kept. I can keep myself. I don't require anything from anyone. It was true. She could keep herself. She had proven that. But keeping yourself and being kept are not the same thing. And the difference, that specific difference, was what she hadn't understood until she was sitting in a kitchen in November with snow on the ground, and a child reading at one end of the table, and a man at the other end who had said, in his unflamboyant way, that he was glad she'd stayed. You could be self-sufficient and still let people in. Those things were not in opposition. She had thought they were for a long time, and she had been wrong. The porridge was good, not special, not elaborate, just good. The way things that are made properly with attention are good. She had made it 100 times. She would make it 100 more. Chet. March came, and the examination, and Noah rode to Millhaven with Elias and came back 2 days later quieter than usual in the way of someone who has spent everything they had on a single effort and is now waiting to find out if it was enough. He did not talk about it. They did not ask. He went back to his work. He fed the animals and helped with the lambing and fixed the section of fence that had heaved with the frost. And he studied in the evenings still, because by then the studying had become habit, and habit is what you do while you wait. The letter came in April. It came on a Tuesday, with the regular mail. Clara handed it to Elias without a word, and Elias took it to Noah in the barn, and she stayed in the kitchen because this was their thing, father and son, a moment that belonged to them. She was rolling dough when she heard Noah's voice, and she could not hear the words, but she could hear the pitch of it, could hear that it was different from the ordinary register, and she pressed her hands flat on the floured board and let out a breath. Lily appeared from the sitting room. "What happened?" "Go see," Clara said. Lily went. Clara stayed at the board. She finished the dough. She set it to rest and washed her hands and stood at the kitchen window. And after a while she saw the three of them crossing the yard from the barn, Elias and Noah and Lily. Lily holding Noah's hand the way she sometimes did with people she was certain of. And she watched them come. Noah came through the door first. His face had done something she hadn't quite seen it do before. Opened slightly, like a window that had been painted shut and someone had finally worked it free. "I got it," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "How did you know?" "The way you walked across the yard?" He stood in the middle of the kitchen. He was 13 years old, and he had a scholarship to study land survey in Cheyenne, and he had the look of someone standing at the beginning of a very long road, seeing it clearly for the first time. "I'm going to be gone for 2 years," he said. "Not sadly, just accounting." "You are." "That's a long time." "It is." He looked at his hands. "Clara." "Yeah." He looked up. "I know you came here because you didn't have anywhere else to go." She waited. "I'm glad you stayed," he said. "Is what I'm trying to say. I'm glad you didn't. I'm glad it worked out this way." She had promised herself early on that she was not going to be the kind of person who cried in front of Noah, because he found that uncomfortable, and she found it undignified in the specific way of doing something private in front of someone who hadn't asked for it. She did not cry. She said, "Me too." And then, because he was 13 and had just gotten a scholarship and was standing in her kitchen waiting to see what came next, she said, "We should celebrate. Get Lily to find the good plates." Noah turned to Lily. "You heard her." "I'm not your servant," Lily said. "I just got a scholarship. You can get your own plates." They argued about the plates all the way to the cabinet, which meant the thing that needed to happen had happened, and now they were just being themselves again, which was the best possible outcome. Elias came to stand beside Clara at the window, and they looked out at the April afternoon together, at the garden beds coming back to life, at the porch that held its weight, at the road running out through the property toward whatever came next. "He's going to be fine," Elias said. "Better than fine," Clara said. He put his hand over hers on the windowsill briefly, then went to help with the plates. She stood at the window for one more moment. Outside, the April light was doing what April light does in Wyoming when the season finally means it, coming in low and gold and landing on everything with a quality of attention, as if the world had turned back toward warmth and was taking its time to notice everything it had missed. The garden rows were dark and soft with new moisture. The fence posts cast their short shadows. The road went on. She had arrived at this window in October with nothing, and she was standing at it now with everything that mattered. Not everything she'd imagined wanting, not some ideal she'd carried in her head since girlhood, but the real specific things, the sound of an argument about plates, and a man's hand over hers, and 2 children she had not given birth to and had not planned and would not trade. The thing nobody tells you, she thought, is that belonging is not something that happens to you. It's something you build, one ordinary day at a time, out of the material you actually have rather than the material you wished for. It's the shelf you fix and the fever you sit through and the letter you write back when you didn't have to. It's the second bowl of soup and the blue ribbon in the hair and the real answer when someone asks you a real question. It accrues, is what it does. Quietly, without fanfare, in the spaces between the things you thought were important. And one day you look up and it's there. Not perfect, not finished, Not the version from the story you told yourself when you were young, but real, solid, yours. She turned away from the window. The kitchen was warm and loud and needed her, and she went back to it.